On today's episode of Photo Kitchen, we pit Capture One against Lightroom Classic in a developing deathmatch. Hello and welcome to episode number 15 of Photo Kitchen. I am your humble host, MD Welch, and today we are talking about Capture One versus Adobe Lightroom Classic. Specifically, what is best to develop your images in. Now, I want to say that I've gotten a lot of questions, especially in 2023, about which of these two programs people should invest their time in when developing their images. I think both programs still have a lot of value. I think they've gone in a little bit of a different direction. I would like it if they were similar or more similar, but essentially for me, Capture One is still really good at importing images, exporting out images. That is really something that Capture One does far better than Adobe Lightroom Classic. Adobe Lightroom Classic, all respect to Adobe, it's terrible for importing. Well, it's not terrible. It's just not great for importing. It is terrible for tethered shooting comparatively to Capture One because Capture One could tether shoot just about anything. But Lightroom Classic is really bad at exporting images compared to Capture One. So in the workflow kind of regards, I prefer Capture One over Lightroom Classic. But for many of you, that might not be your workflow. You might not need that high-end export, import, tethering feature that Capture One does. For many people using these two programs, it boils down to how good can they make their images look with the least amount of effort. So let's do that with these applications. Let's put them through a bit of a Pepsi challenge. Now, here are the requirements. They're both camera raw images. They're not going into Photoshop. We're going to leverage the programs for the technology that they possess internally. Yes, I could throw these into Photoshop. Yes, I could do more stuff with them. But let's just see what these applications can do. And I have pulled a bit of a Julia Childs here. I have pulled them out of the oven. Both images have already been developed. So this is the before in Capture One. And if I hop over to Lightroom, this is the before inside of Lightroom. And that's where I actually want to start because a lot of people believe that Capture One does a better job with initial color science than Lightroom Classic. So I'll let you take a look. This is Capture One out of camera. This is Adobe Lightroom Classic. Capture One, Lightroom Classic. There is a difference. Do you like one over the other? To me, the Capture One has a little bit more color. It has a little bit more saturation to it. It's a little bit warmer, which as a Sony shooter is a big issue for me. Sometimes those files could come off green. So I think that for me as a Sony shooter, I like what Capture One starts off with. By the way, it's not that big of a deal, honestly. I mean, it's great to say, oh, Capture One does a better job at the start, but is that going to really make an impact when you do all of this editing? So I will turn off my before views here. I will come in and do the same in Lightroom. Also, there's a little bit of a light stand over on the far left-hand side of the frame. We could crop that out later. Not worried about it right now. Now, it's safe to say in 2023, these programs have probably the biggest difference in developing technology than ever before. They have gone down different paths, and there's some pros and cons to both. So first of all, let me walk you through what I have done in Capture One. I'm going to come into my adjustments here. And the first thing that's a major difference between Capture One and Lightroom Classic is that Capture One a few versions ago introduced the concept of layers. And those layers behave very much like they behave inside of Photoshop. You have opacity controls that you could adjust. You have the ability to do luminance controls as well. And it's a very powerful feature. Now, Lightroom has gone to kind of a layer layout as well, but it's a little bit of in a different direction. They now have much more powerful masking technology than Capture One has. They don't truly have layers. You have to make a mask, you have to manipulate that mask, and certainly you could fill the whole mask with black or white if you wanted to. But everything begins on a mask level inside of Lightroom Classic, or inside of Capture One, you have layers that you could apply stuff to and then be able to mask that out later on. So the layer concept is better inside of Capture One. Another reason why the layer concept is better inside of Capture One is that you could do just about any adjustment you want to a layer, and then you could control its opacity and its luma or luminance range. You can't do that necessarily inside of Lightroom Classic, but we'll dive into that in a second. So in this image, starting off first, I'll turn off my additional things. I did a very basic background adjustment here. First of all, one thing I do like about Capture One is that there is an ability to have better ICC profiling built into the application. You don't have to do any additional stuff with it. It's just built in. So I set this to the Pro standard for Sony, and I also open up my shadows, setting the curve to extra shadows. So I have a little bit of a better starting off point using this particular feature. Now, as far as the actual settings go, I did an overall white balance in both images, or at least in both programs. I white balanced the mountains back here. That was my white balance source. I didn't have a white card on me. Well, I didn't use it at least. The exposure, I raised the exposure a little bit here to point about a third of a stop. Contrast, I did not touch. More on that in a second. There is a control in Capture One that I prefer far more than Lightroom Classic, and that is the brightness control. Brightness doesn't exist inside of Lightroom Classic, and I really wish that it did. It actually did several versions ago, but I don't know if it did what Capture One currently does. So the brightness slider essentially brightens or darkens the image, but what it doesn't do is touch the extreme highlights or shadows of the image. So you could really crank up the brightness, and essentially you're only brightening the midtones and you're leaving the extremes alone. I love this because I don't have to worry about clipping my highlights or clipping my shadows as much inside of Capture One as I do in Lightroom. Lightroom simply has an exposure slider, and I wish it had a brightness slider. I did do an overall boost of saturation, and this is one thing to come back into Lightroom Classic that I prefer in Lightroom Classic. Inside the basics panel, you have vibrance and saturation, which I like a little bit more because it allows me to, say, warm up flush tones without oversaturating an image. So here I've made a little bit more of an adjustment. And by the way, I've done my editing Lightroom Classic about a day or so after. I didn't do them exactly at the same time. So this is a little bit more saturated than my Capture One image. So do keep that in mind. Now, for the rest of this high dynamic range, I left the highlights alone. I opened up the shadows a bit. I knocked the whites way, way down, and I opened up the blacks. Now, the reason why I did so much, especially with the highlights, was I needed to darken down this sky. Unfortunately, the masking technology inside of Capture One is very primitive compared to what Lightroom Classic does. So I usually handle all of these extremes inside of a basic exposure adjustment. From there, I don't think I did too much else. High dynamic range, levels, I left alone. There's no levels control, by the way, inside of Lightroom Classic, was unfortunate. I'm going to get into curve in a second. Color editor and balance I did separately as well. No black and white. Clarity, I left alone. I usually do a little bit of structure, but I left it alone. I didn't do any dehaze. Dehaze works very much like Lightroom Classic, which we could get to in a second. And I left vignetting alone. Now, where Capture One starts to really show its power is, again, in layers. And the first area is contrast. I do all my contrast in a layer. If I crank this all the way back up to 100, you can see what the initial contrast looks like. And I don't really overthink this. I go to my curves adjustment panel. Unlike Lightroom Classic, I could exclusively enhance the luminance values or the luminance contrast inside of curves. If you don't know this, inside of Lightroom Classic and also Photoshop, unless you use blending modes, if you do a curve adjustment or tone curve adjustment, when you do this, you will actually increase the saturation of the image as well. So not a huge deal, but if you're trying to isolate luminance or tonal controls from your actual color saturation, this is a big deal, and I like this. So I do just a basic luminance. I do presets. Right? I'm not ashamed to say it. I do presets here. I did a contrast luminance value here, and then I have that inside of a layer, and I just lowered the contrast until I was happy with it, which I think it was like 40 or 60 or something like that. Let's bring it back down to 40. There we go. Now, another thing that I love about Capture One over Lightroom Classic is that I can color grade. Now, you can do this inside of Lightroom Classic. However, you can't do certain things to masks inside of Lightroom Classic, which we'll see in a second here. So when I do a color grade, and I'll come over to here to my actual color grading controls, I can do this in a separate layer. So I could turn this on and off. And you could see, if I could go all the way up with it, you could see what my color grade was. And I have the ability to do that color grade, do those fine adjustments. But then if overall I feel like it's not enough, I could always just back it down. And I think I was at 80 or something like that. and just take that off a little bit. Another thing that I could do that I've really fallen in love with lately with color grade is that I could come into here and I could luma or luminance range this, and I can refine or control where this actually goes to. So if I turn on the mask here, you could see that I'm not applying that actual color grade to the absolute blacks or absolute whites or dark or bright areas of the image. So I don't get sometimes what happens with color grading when you get kind of a blocky look to a color grade. Like it's hard to explain, but there just seems to be a little bit of loss of contrast. And that's because you're turning things that are white, maybe slightly yellow if you're warming up your highlights, or you turn things that are black almost to like a bluish navy color. This allows you to just really refine those controls, and I prefer that. I really like it. And now that I'm using it more and more, I think my color grading looks better in Capture One. However, if we switch over to Lightroom Classic in 2023 had the most radical change of these two programs. You could just do so much now. And before I get into that so much, if I come into here, basics control, profile was set to camera neutral. Again, I did basically the same things here. I adjusted the exposure, highlights, shadows, whites, blacks. There's no brightness controls, so I had to control that. I did a little bit of clarity. I did a little bit of vibrance and saturation. One thing I will give Lightroom Classic a whole lot of credit for is that the detail function in this program, sharpening basically, and noise reduction is so much easier to control and visualize. If you don't know about the little trick about going to the masking slider for the detail panel and holding down Option on the Mac, Alt on Windows, let me blow your mind here. You can now selectively, not now, you've been able to do this for multiple versions, but basically here, as you slide the mask over, anything that is white will be sharpened. We'll have these settings applied. Anything that's black will not be sharpened at all. This is a great way to reduce noise. And a reason why so many people still combat noise, especially inside of Lightroom Classic, is they don't realize they could actually just not sharpen the noise. You're sharpening the noise when you increase the sharpening in the detail panel. That's a great way to knock it out. And it's so much easier to visualize that in Capture One. You could do it in Capture One. It's just really hard to see it, or it's just so easy to work with inside of Lightroom Classic. Now, after I've done these basic things, calibration was set to the correct thing. I kind of have my base value here. But when I come to the mask icon and come into here, this is where the heavy lifting is now really being done in Lightroom Classic, and where this has probably surpassed Capture One in so many ways. With the mask control here, I'll just turn off my masks. I have two going on here. You can see what the image looks like without any sort of masking going on. So if I was to hop back over to Capture One and we do a compare here, we're kind of on the same page, right? Sky's a little bit darker in the Capture One image simply because I had to address that. But overall, maybe a little bit more saturation, maybe a little bit more brightness inside the Lightroom Classic. Again, I'm not matching up targets or anything like that, but you can see, relatively speaking, we're in the same ballpark, at least. It's a big ballpark, but we're in the same ballpark. But when I turn on masks, watch what happens. All of a sudden, my subject brightens and my sky darkens. And this is because of the technology that's now found inside of Lightroom Classic. You can now make masks using machine learning or artificial intelligence, and it does a really good job of selecting subjects, selecting the sky, backgrounds, even individual people, as well as objects. Using your brush, you still have linear and radial gradient, which, by the way, you have linear and radial gradient inside of Capture One, but it does not have the machine learning, right? The select sky feature, select subjects feature, it's just not there yet inside of Capture One. Now, the problem with masking, well, let's actually back up here. So the first mask I did was for subject, where I just actually did two masks. You could see here that I selected the subject, and then if I expand this, if I click on it, there's actually two masks in here, which is so powerful that you could combine masks inside of this. So here's my subject. Anything that's red is being adjusted. Anything that's not red is not being adjusted. So I select my subject, and then I used a linear gradient to basically draw a gradation. So I'm not actually doing anything except as I'm just starting at the bottom or mid thigh up to the top of the head. So I'm not brightening up the feet. It doesn't look like the feet are going to pop off the ground or anything like that. I have a subtle, little bit more power to the flash that was used on site. I'm able to lift that. And I just did an overall, just a lift of brightness, a little exposure, and I just warmed up the image just a touch. Nothing fancy, but it is noticeable here, right? Make the subject pop a little bit more. The other thing that I did is I used the select sky feature and I selected the sky here. Again, though, I used multiple masks. The subject or the sky itself was getting a little bit of the hair and the shirt of the model. I could then use machine learning to say, select the subject and remove that from that mask. This whole process that I did I could actually do it on camera faster than explaining to you what I did. It starts to really open up the mind to what you could do in this program. And by the way, do less in other programs, say like Photoshop. So powerful masking feature here has given me a little bit more punch to the subject. It has allowed me to darken down the sky, add a little bit more color. Now, have I done the exact same thing in Capture One? Am I similar here? Yeah, I'm close, right? Could I live without Lightroom Classic? To be sure, but it's so powerful with these masking features, it's hard to ignore it. So that's kind of a breakdown between the two. Now, what is best? It's really up to you. What I would say is Lightroom Classic is still a very prosumer application. The lack of total camera support for tethering means you're not going to use it as a digital tech. The lack of powerful export features also makes it very limiting or very time consuming when you're exporting out a lot of files. So if I needed 5 or 6 different versions of this file to be exported out, it can be really troublesome to do that in Lightroom Classic. Yes, there are export presets now, but they're not all that powerful because they can't really leverage metadata. Right. So I can't make new folders based upon metadata information and direct these files. Where Capture One, and I've done other videos on this, has such powerful export features. It's ridiculous that I can make 18, 20 different versions of this file, have them be renamed and go into different folders, all based upon metadata. And Capture One still really leads in that area. But if you're not a digital tech, right? If you're not using those, that import, powerful export part of the application, if you're just using Lightroom to get organized, manage a catalog, do a lot of developing, I think Lightroom is definitely head and shoulders above Lightroom Classic. Yes, the layer control is better inside of Capture One. One thing I skipped over, you can't do certain adjustments to the mask inside of Lightroom Classic, which is silly, right? Fun fact, you can do curves adjustment to Lightroom, not Lightroom Classic in a mask, but you can't do it to Lightroom Classic. So there's some things that don't carry over even between Adobe programs. But if they could allow you to do a mask for every single one of these panels here, it's definitely far better than Capture One. But the fact that color grading is still very clunky, the fact that you can't do luminance curves, it is a little bit limiting depending on how you edit. But if you're not leveraging that technology, or you don't need that technology, but you need to be able to select people fast and just brighten them up and turn things around, Lightroom Classic is certainly the application for you. Well, I hope this answered the debate, or at least gave you more information on the debate and which direction to go with your developing choices. I'd love to hear about what you're doing inside the comments, which program you're using, what is your workflow. Also, if you haven't done so already, please like this video and subscribe to this channel, and don't hesitate to share this with your other photography post-production friends. So until next time, I'm MD Welch, wishing you all the best from Photo Kitchen.